I've been talking about this for 7 months before President Trump stepped foot into office. I said this was going to happen because it's exactly what's in the policy papers. And that's where policy comes from. It doesn't come from President Trump's brain or the neocon warmongers that he surrounds himself with. These are all just facilitators of this policy. It doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter if they're senile or conscious of what they're doing. There's one policy. It's produced by corporations and financial institutions in these think tanks. They put these plans on paper that are almost always public, and then they implement it chapter by chapter, line by line. If you go to the table of contents of Which Path to Persia, you go through the table of contents, you can see that every single president from Bush Jr. all the way up until today has exercised every single one of these options exactly as they were written down. It's not as if this specific paper was the blueprint. It's a reflection of consensus with among these special interests, what is to be done. The policy papers are turned into bills or policies by teams of lawyers and brought to Washington to be signed off on by lobbyists. That is how it works. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything about how any of this works. And that is why people are constantly surprised, because they're trying to track political rhetoric and they're looking at political divides that don't actually exist, that are actually all theater meant to distract you and divide you. And so back in, I think it was 2022, 2023, they produced a series of papers titled Project 2025. And in that paper, it says Europe is going to spend 5% on defense, on NATO, of their GDP, on NATO. And that is exactly what happened. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in February this year told Europe in Brussels, he said, you're going to take over this war against Russia, because we have to pivot to China. I mentioned this earlier in the program. And you're going to spend 5% of your GDP on defense. You can buy weapons from us because the U.S. is overstretched. And Secretary Hegseth literally said there needs to be a division of labor. We cannot just do it all on our own. We need our proxies to start diverting public money from programs that actually benefit the people living in their countries. And we need to start spending it on our proxy war, just like we in the United States have been doing, depriving the American people of any sort of decent life or future. That's what Europe needs to do. And people ask, why? Why does Europe do this? Because it's been politically captured, just like Ukraine has been politically captured. They have captured the institutions through big money interests. They control them through various institutions, as well as the EU itself is a layer of bureaucracy thrown over the European nations as a blanket smothering national sovereignty across the region. And all of these nations, obviously, demonstratably, are working against their own best interests to facilitate U.S. foreign policy, not just in Europe regarding Ukraine and Russia, but also regards to everything else, in regards to China, in regards to Iran, in regards to the continent of Africa, in regards to absolutely everything the U.S. is interested in doing. They get their proxies to pay the price for them. That's how empire has always worked. Today is a modern day empire. So when they talk about the Europeans being children, well, they're imperial subjects. They're vassals, as we have been warning. And the scary thing is, though, it's all accelerating very quickly, very recklessly, because again, I've been on your program, Danny, we've talked about this. They're out of time. They see multipolarism rising. They see China exponentially rising. And they know the window of opportunity to do this is to reassert themselves is closing. Once it's closed, it's irreversible. So that's why they're rushing through this. Whether it's going to work or not, they don't care. It's better to try it. Everyone else is going to pay the price for it. They will be the last ones to pay the price for it. Their proxies will pay. American soldiers will pay. The American public will pay. They will be the very last people to pay. So there's no reason for them not to try.
The message that Donald Trump posted from Mark Rutte himself sent to Donald Trump. This is just ridiculous. This is Donald Trump posting on his Truth Social from Mark Rutte, a message. Congratulations and thank you for your decisive action in Iran. That was truly extraordinary, something no one else dared to do. It makes us all safer. You're flying into The Hague with another big success this evening. It was not easy, but we've got them all signed on to 5%. Donald, you've driven us to a really, really important moment for America and Europe and the world. You will achieve something no other American could get done in decades. Europe is going to pay in a big way, as they should, and it will be your win. Safe travels, and see you at the dinner.
He just said what I said, didn't he?
He's also showing the truth about these negotiations. There are no negotiations right now, mind you. And now he is pointing at Vladimir Putin. He says NATO is not a ripoff, and Putin is the more difficult partner in ending the Ukraine conflict. This is from the Wall Street Journal. So
I mean, to the point of, I'm not even kidding, absolute exhaustion. I'm physically and mentally exhausted trying to warn people about this. Again, before President Trump even stepped foot into office, his nominee for vice president, J.D. Vance, was saying, we're dumping the war in Ukraine on Europe. We're not ending it because we need our weapons to go fight China. That is literally what they're doing right now. That is what we see unfolding right now. They, not me, I didn't warn you. They told you, but people were just hearing what they wanted to hear. And in many times, they just imagined things that were never even said in the first place. I know people that genuinely believe President Trump was going to possibly even dismantle NATO or walk away from NATO. And that was just again, theater to panic people into doubling down on supporting NATO and creating public support for NATO. That's all it was. It was theater. People have to remember, go to YouTube, type in Donald Trump WWE. He is a performer. He does theatrics. He has done it for years and years of his life. He had his own reality TV show, which had nothing to do with reality. It was all scripted. That is how he does business. He made his living in real estate and in casinos. Why do people believe that this is a man that was going to change anything? It just, at face value, was absurd. It was an absurd proposition from the beginning. It is not how the U.S. government works. Even if he genuinely did want to change everything, there is no power in the White House or in Congress. These are people that sign off on things just to make it official, and they are people who sell it to the public. The policies are devised by these corporations and these think tanks. That's where people need to focus. They want to change anything, they need to change that aspect of it. And when I always talk about this, I always hear people moan and groan and roll their eyes. The corporations that you give your paycheck to every single month, they're the ones creating the problem. Those are the people you need to undermine. It doesn't matter what you say or do in Washington. Those interests, you need to undermine support for them. And it's very easy for you to do it. You just stop giving them your money and find alternatives. Ultimately, that's what multipolarism is. It is creating alternatives to the U.S. system, not trying to reform it or fix it or convince it to stop doing what it's doing. It is the entire planet creating an alternative system and leaving the U.S. in the corner by itself until it learns how to play nicely with others. That's what Americans need to do if they have any real hope of changing things inside the U.S. And in the meantime, the rest of the world has to continue investing in multipolarism. Each one of us, in our own way, needs to do, you don't have to do it overnight, but a little percentage each month paying into multipolarism instead of Wall Street, Washington, London, Brussels. This is what's going to make a difference and is already making a difference. Millions of people are already doing it. Add to it.
You could argue that this NATO summit, it's so interesting, was likely the most friendly and the NATO summit is generally a gathering that has no real divisions in it, but Donald Trump, his administration, this whole moment of history, Trump coming back in, has been framed as by many the now big divide between the US and Europe, that there was these huge problems between them. And what we've seen is Europe not only fall in line to Donald Trump, but essentially this gathering was a demonstration of how symbiotic it really all is. In the Ukraine conflict itself, look at what's happened there. Maybe you can help us with an update there, because the negotiation side, that has fallen apart. And Russia has recently said they've not only have been forced to take a pause with the U.S. because the U.S. pulled out of the negotiations, but they're saying they're not talking to Kiev either anymore. So where are we, Brian?
So we have to remember, why does NATO exist? NATO exists to encircle and contain Russia. And it's also been gradually expanding the scope of that. I mean, it has always been waging all of these other wars, but it's always been as a means of eliminating nations friendly to Russia, and also now also China. That has become a priority for NATO. That's the only reason it exists. So why is President Trump asking all of these, demanding and forcing all of these countries to pay 5% of the GDP into NATO? Because he is advancing U.S. primacy worldwide. Remember everybody saying, I heard Marco Rubio say something about multipolarism. That must mean he accepts and supports multipolarism. No, all he was doing was recognizing that it exists, and that it was yet another thing the U.S. needs to burn to the ground and destroy. That's all that was. And now we can see that's all it was. We can see it unraveling in front of us right now. That is what this whole NATO summit was all about. It was about the theatrics are over. We've gotten to the position where we need to be, and now it's time to push all of this forward. We tried to use diplomacy to lure the Russians in. We carried out strikes on them as they were negotiating. We did the exact same thing to Iran. It's probably going to be a while before anyone trusts negotiating with the U.S. ever again, although I don't know why anyone would in the first place. And so that's where we are. And we have to remember, all of these conflicts are interconnected. It is not just the U.S. fighting Iran and then just coincidentally also Ukraine, and also coincidentally building up in the Asia Pacific. In the policy papers, this is all part of one policy to maintain what they call American leadership worldwide, which that just means American domination worldwide. The elimination, the war on sovereignty, peace, stability, prosperity for everybody around the world, except the handful of elite running U.S. foreign policy.
You know, Brian, we're only, someone said,
not even a year.
Yeah, that's why somebody said to me this recently. They're like, there's 3.5 left. You know, there's 3.5 years left of just the Trump administration. People make this out. Oh, you're an anti-Trump, all this. No. We, for me, I am pro the truth, which is that the Trump administration is operating just like prior administrations, including his first, operated, just in a different historical context. So that makes me want to know, Brian, your assessment of, well, what happens to the Ukraine conflict from here? Because what's so interesting about this NATO summit is this is how they're talking about it, exactly how we're talking about it right now. Not kind of shockingly, here's the Guardian. Trump news at a glance. Daddy Trump showered with praise on triumphant lap through NATO summit, where he celebrated the commitment by NATO allies to boost defense spending by 5% of GDP. So this is, CNN, all of them, they're talking in the same exact way. Very little about Ukraine. So what's next for this? Because in my estimation, NATO, one of, as you said, its main mission is Russia, encirclement of Russia. Well, the Ukraine conflict is huge in that.
Yeah, the conflict in Ukraine continues. The U.S. had no intention at all of ever stopping it. They're going to keep it going until the last Ukrainian. They have literally said that in Washington. They are going to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. Notice how President Trump is flanked by his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. These were people that I was told were not arch neocons, and that these were people that were going to help President Trump remove the U.S. from all of this globalism and pursuit of global domination, and focus in on the United States, fight the globalist liberal order. And now they're all there doing they literally say a victory lap because they have achieved this 5% of GDP spending on the military, which is going to be used to keep the conflict in Ukraine going for as long as possible. Now, the U.S. literally has no possible way of focusing on Ukraine, on Iran, and China at the same time. And they have openly said repeatedly, and all the way back in February, just as President Trump's administration was beginning. And this is what President Biden set up for 4 years during his administration, set the stage for this pivot toward China. And this division of labor, the Europeans are going to have to take over the conflict in Ukraine, keep it going for as long as possible, keep Russia tied down in Ukraine, raise the cost as high as possible for Russia so that they can dismember Iran. People are like, why isn't Russia helping Iran? Because Russia's at war with all of NATO right now. That's why. Why isn't China swooping in and saving Iran? They literally don't have a military designed to project military power into the Middle East. Their military is stationed almost entirely inside of China, and it's facing off against hundreds of U.S. troops inside their territory, the island province of Taiwan, and tens of thousands of troops in the Philippines, which is a growing military presence for the U.S., Japan, all across Japan, and South Korea. And their ships are plying the waters of the South China Sea, not to protect maritime trade there from China. It's all of China's maritime trade. They're there to disrupt it when and if possible. And so that is what everybody was warned was going to happen. That is literally what is happening right now. So no, they're not going to talk about Ukraine, but the conflict in Ukraine has not gone away, and they're going to continue it. And that was the whole purpose of forcing Europe to divert 5% of their GDP into defense spending, military spending, so that they can take over for the U.S. and the U.S. can take its resources and focus it on toppling the government in Iran, or at least destroying the region as much as possible, and building up its military in the Asia Pacific region vis-a-vis China. Secretary Heggs had told everyone publicly that was the plan, and that is what they're doing. And for whatever reason, people hoped against hope that the things they were saying they were going to do were somehow not going to happen. Well, it is happening right now, right before our eyes.
I mean, it's kind of stunning how obvious it is. It should be a real slap in the face to anyone who thinks otherwise, because on the one hand, you have this like coronation fawning over Donald Trump at the NATO summit, and Trump really reciprocating. I mean, this isn't the confrontational, the what you said, Ryan, the political theater. Oh, I'm gonna slap you on the head. I'm gonna bring you down to size, whatever it is that Donald Trump was saying to NATO. And then you have on both of these fronts, you have with the Russia front now Trump is talking about Putin being the bigger problem. Now you have Donald Trump escalating, and this was regardless of the ceasefire, the incredible things I've heard about Trump bombing for peace. I've heard this. This is the strikes were intentionally limited so that it could force a ceasefire. I'm just like, guys, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And
plain delusion.
If you send B-2 bombers to bomb a sovereign nation's territory, that's never peace. And not only that, but even if they were intentionally limited, the reason is not because of a ceasefire or the desire to do a ceasefire. The reason is these strikes were obviously to feel out what's going on, what are the actual capabilities, / maybe the United States actually is kind of limited right now and does not want to use all of its resources for something like this. Maybe it didn't want to supposedly start a bigger conflict. That doesn't mean it doesn't want one soon in the near future, tomorrow, next year. It doesn't matter. The point is it's not to force a ceasefire. That's ridiculous. So all this is to say is now we have Donald Trump, of course, the people around him, all one unit operating as both neocon hawks on Iran. We have to be very clear on this. With Russia, it doesn't look any different from the Biden administration. Look at the attacks just before the so-called 12-day war, Israel and Iran, Brian. What did we see? We saw Ukraine deep into Russian territory with these drones, bombing Russian bombers, striking Russian bombers. It's just on and on.
Not Ukraine, though. Not Ukraine, because the New York Times already revealed from 2014 onward, not 2022, 2014 onward, the CIA took over the intelligence agencies that carried that attack out. There are U.S. generals at a military base in Germany overseeing the entire chain of command in the Ukrainian military. This is a U.S. war fought through Ukraine, just like it is a U.S. war being fought through Israel against Iran, and just like it is a U.S. war that will be fought against the rest of China through the island province of Taiwan and also the Southeast Asian archipelago nation of the Philippines. So this is the reality. People need to see this. And if they were, you cannot blame people for making mistakes or their analysis is flawed because their process was flawed, and then in turn their conclusions are flawed. But now we can see that it's just not adding up. So then you have to go back to the drawing board. Get literally, I do this. I get a clean piece of paper, and you start at first principles. Where does all this policy come from? Who actually has power and leverage? And what is it? Where is it coming from? Where are you getting it from? Money and guns is how human power has always been. Weapons and wealth, and then today it's money and guns. That is where power comes from. So look at who has the most of that, and that's where the power is flowing from. It's not from some artificially tanned real estate developer in the White House. It's not coming from him. It's coming from obviously somewhere else. And so people need to be more realistic about how they assess this and analyze it, and then they can draw the right conclusions. And our job, Danny, you and me, our job is to raise awareness of this, to warn people. And we have been talking about this for years. We warned people this is exactly what was going to happen, and now it's happening. So now I hope that everyone, at least now, is on the same page. And you have to ask yourself, if you're not on the same page, why is it? Is it because you have actual evidence to the contrary that none of this is true? Or is it because this is a truth you want to believe in rather than just facing the actual truth? People really have to ask themselves that question. Every time you have to draw a conclusion, you should ask yourself, Is this because it's the conclusion I wish it was, or is it because there's sufficient evidence to support it? We have to do that.
Putting hope on anything that the United States is doing as a regime, as a political regime, foreign policy establishment, and of course the forces that truly control it, is really a waste of time with what is really needed, which is spreading the truth, providing people with the information they need. That's the aim of its true alternative independent media. And of course, all the other steps, the ones that you mentioned earlier, Brian, and in terms of connecting with the multipolar world, and of course all the activity that's needed to really demand and make changes on the current leadership and here in the collective West. That's what's needed, because here you have Donald Trump. You know, it's so obvious now, looking at providing Kiev with more Patriot missiles, right? But this is what's really interesting is Donald Trump met with Vladimir Zelensky for 50 minutes, and he said he's looking to provide Patriot missiles that Ukraine needs, and Vladimir Putin really has to end the war. So he now doesn't even sound any different from Joe Biden on Russia. This was what people were hanging on to. And in just a matter of 6 months, everything is, even on the rhetoric side, even on the PR side, it's all different now. Everything is falling into line, and we see that the United States as an empire, not the people, not the whatever, it's this empire. They are consolidating in really looking to do exactly as you said, Brian, divide the labor and see what's possible. They tested a little with Iran. They're continuing with Russia. And of course, we're always going to be having to pay attention with China, because we've got a long way to go in just the Trump administration alone. And a lot has already happened.
Yeah, I mean, just regarding Ukraine, when Trump became president, what the U.S. began doing is just laundering all of its escalations through Europe. That's all they did. So when you see NATO member nations trying to seize tankers carrying Russian hydrocarbons, that is ultimately being presided over by the United States. The U.S. runs NATO. It is an institution that exists for the United States and its geopolitical objectives around the world, especially in Europe. So that was Trump's policy, but he was laundering it through Europe. There was this perception management taking place that tried to create the illusion of distance between the U.S. and the war in Ukraine. And this was all because they were working on negotiations. I think they hoped somehow they could trick Russia into some sort of ceasefire, because they can see what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. The Ukrainian lines continue to just incrementally crumble and fall back. And if it just keeps doing that, eventually all of Ukraine collapses, and then that war is over, and then the U.S. cannot use it as a pressure point against Russia any longer. As a matter of fact, it'll become a pressure point for themselves, aimed at them. And so we have to pay attention to what is really going on. If NATO is doing all of these things against Russia, if there are all of these sanctions being applied to Russia, but just it's not the U.S. doing it directly, but it still serves the exact same purpose. Ultimately, this is a U.S. proxy war. Europe's not getting anything out of this. They're not benefiting from this. That's how you know they're politically captured, because nothing they're doing is in the benefit of the European people or the European states, or even the European special interests in these. There's huge corporations in Germany that are just wasting away because they're subordinate to U.S. corporations.